The majority of skeptics who approach the UAP topic are adamant against any involvement whatsoever of non-human intelligence. Most of them refuse to admit that any of the available evidence points to even the possibility of being related to NHI. In part 2 of Science is Wrong About UAP, I'm going to highlight the fallacies in their assessment and expose the flaws in their reasoning. Welcome back to UAP as NHI. The opening theme is Restore and the artist is Donbor. I'm your host Bill Seago, and in this episode we continue where we left off with Science is Wrong About UAP. Be sure to visit uapasnhi.com to discover future topics that will be discussed on the program. In part 2 of the episode, I will highlight specific reasons why the approach adopted by many in the scientific and skeptical communities regarding the UAP topic are both limited and flawed, often just as incorrect as the proponent who claims a testimony or account is undoubtedly of NHI origin prior to any vetting. I'll also provide reasons why skeptics and scientists should at the very least accept the possibility of NHI associated with UAP based on cases or testimony that might suggest no other viable interpretation, rather than getting stuck in their scientific dogmas. I will then provide a few examples where skeptics sometimes commit logical fallacies in their argument, often completely ignoring aspects of the available evidence that might lend support to a claim, while highlighting others that might discredit it. I'll continue where I left off in part 1 with additional arguments skeptics promote against some of the claims made by eyewitnesses or those promoted by the UFO community. One of the biggest go-to arguments often spouted by skeptics is that our memories and recollections about a particular event become distorted and embellished over time. That also applies to recollecting any account from our immediate or distant past. While this is certainly true, it cannot account for all of the credible cases out there, especially ones where testimony was gathered shortly after the sighting, or where a video of the object was captured to accompany the account. While a personal account is technically subjective, in most instances it would align with an objective reality of what actually occurred. Perhaps we should ask ourselves just how reliable anecdotal testimony is in general, rather than immediately assigning it as an invalid interpretation of evidence. How dependable is it in general for obtaining a truth when it comes to navigating the real world and interacting with others? Is there a way to measure its accuracy and put an actual percentage on its overall reliability? Perhaps we could use Bayesian inference to calculate just how reliable anecdotal evidence or testimony is in our daily lives. Could we then compare a specific number of accurate everyday anecdotal accounts to the same number of the best UAP cases and generalize it to deduce whether just a single UFO account would have to be accurate, if only based on the law of averages? In other words, if X percentage of everyday anecdotal accounts are found to be true compared to X percentage found to be false among accounts provided by the general population, then what might that suggest in relation to the percentage of UAP accounts being reliably accurate in relation to the overall number of valid UAP reports put forth? I'm talking about mundane accounts that even a skeptic or scientist would agree is accurate or trustworthy without the need for scientific scrutiny, such as credible historical evidence or an event that was relayed on the news last night that included a live video of it. The only difference is that it takes just a single UAP account to be an accurate description of what really occurred for there to be a suggestion of an NHI presence. I'm specifically referring to cases that would effectively eliminate any natural or mundane possibility based on the close proximity of the sighting, where the object performs maneuvers that a scientist would agree are impossible to known physics. And even then, we are only seeking possibilities or probabilities that the object is of NHI origin, considering an alternative explanation could be a top-secret technology based on unknown physics. I would be willing to bet that any comparison of everyday anecdotal accounts to the best anecdotal UAP reports would suggest that a significant number of them are in fact a reliable interpretation. Another argument put forth by skeptics is based on crash retrieval claims. They basically argue that an alien civilization able to make it to Earth should be too advanced to crash their ship or get brought down. That would also apply to any type of advanced civilization regardless of origin. But for now, let's examine this line of reasoning based on the extraterrestrial hypothesis. If we could suspend judgment for this thought experiment and consider the plethora of reports and images that depict a range of vastly different craft and a variety of different types of NHI, then perhaps there are multiple intelligences in our presence from multiple sources, some more or less advanced than others. If one of those intelligences only recently arrived and are in the midst of getting familiar with our environment, weather, lightning, magnetic fields, military weapons, instruments that might interfere with their navigation systems, or any number of unfamiliar factors they have yet to identify, adjust to, and then rectify, then perhaps it isn't a stretch to consider that not all of them are godlike or invincible. It could also be argued that some might harbor competing or conflicting motives and that they might occasionally bring each other down. Any number of factors could be responsible for the occasional accident, especially if their craft are as prevalent as the best reports suggest. Besides, we can't assume that an advanced intelligence would be incapable of making an error just because they would be considerably more advanced than we are. Cars are a lot more advanced than they were 100 years ago, but there are still traffic accidents. We are significantly more advanced than our ancestors. However, that does not mean we are above making mistakes or having accidents, even if only to a lesser degree. To assume any being is above that would be granting them literal godlike status. And if there are a large number of them here on a daily basis, as the evidence might suggest, then even 100 reports of crash retrievals over the span of 100 years would be a drop in the bucket compared to the overall number of reports made over that time, especially if we included the likely larger number of reports not made or not witnessed. Yet another argument is based on the fact that many videos or photographs of UAP are fuzzy, grainy, or out of focus. Neil deGrasse Tyson flippantly argues that we should have tons and tons of good videos since there are now tons and tons of cell phones out there. Tyson appears to be committing a fallacy of the consequent here. He's basically saying if there are actually valid UAP, then we should have tons of clear UAP videos. We do not have tons of clear cell phone videos, therefore there are no valid UAP. Well, an alternative answer to that is that we do have tons of cell phone evidence, and the ones that are clear are consistently disregarded as being too good to be true prior to any actual analysis. Skeptics immediately discount or ignore any good image in order to avoid admitting the possibility that some of what is being recorded could potentially be non-terrestrial. Perhaps it would be more appropriate to analyze these videos using scientific means rather than just assuming there are none. Not only that, but just because we have more phones doesn't mean people are more apt to look up at the sky to catch a glimpse of one in the first place. If anything, more people have their heads down and glued to those very phones with the thought of looking up in the hopes of capturing a UAP, the very last thing on their minds. Regardless, it's difficult enough to get a clear video of an airplane performing no maneuvers at all with a cell phone, let alone an anomalous and unpredictable craft where if you blink you miss it. Additionally, it's not easy to zoom in on an object while holding the phone still. It's difficult to keep a stationary object centered on many modern phones while zoomed in, let alone one that is moving. The sudden, erratic, and high-speed maneuvers these craft appear to make would intrinsically make capturing them with any clarity difficult. It's frankly not easy to get a clear image of something moving in the sky, regardless of how good the phone camera may be. That doesn't even account for the fact that a shy NHI may actively camouflage their craft to a degree that distorts how we perceive it, or the drive that propels the craft may interfere with or affect the environment around it, let alone affect the electronics of the camera, which might at the very least change our visual perception of it or our ability to accurately focus on it. That being said, what skeptics fail to realize from a lack of any effort to investigate is that there are indeed many videos clear enough to make a determination that what is being filmed does not belong in the sky. When a video is relatively clear, their immediate answer is that they can be easily faked these days. It appears these witnesses can't win for losing. But whether a video is fuzzy, grainy, or blurry should not attest to its authenticity one way or the other. Sources should also be considered in addition to eyewitness reaction, testimony, and credibility. Combine these factors with what the object is doing, and there still remains a plethora of video evidence just waiting to be further analyzed. Some will turn out to be natural phenomena, some mundane objects or known craft, and some will be hoaxed, but not all of them will. What's left over should be treated as possibly of NHI origin. Perhaps there will come a day when someone will analyze the best UAP videos with the proper AI video analysis program and discover a considerable number of them that cannot be explained in conventional terms. Skeptics also argue that ufologists claim commercial and military pilots, among other professionals whose job relies on having good observational skills, are incapable of making errors in observation. That is not what ufologists claim. What they are actually claiming is that they are obviously more reliable than the average eyewitness, and that this should be a factor when deducing potential errors in observation. These individuals are absolutely more of a dependable source for eyewitness observations of this sort, and their accounts should be granted more credibility than those of the average eyewitness. We should certainly trust the observational account of a pilot with X amount of flight hours who claims to have witnessed something out of the ordinary over the account of a passenger on the same plane experiencing their first flight. Obviously, there should be more weight given to an anomalous sighting by a pilot who has already witnessed a variety of different objects from that vantage point over a passenger witnessing the same object who pays little, if any, attention to what's going on outside their window. In addition, a pilot would be less motivated to jeopardize his or her career by coming forward with a UAP report if they weren't positive that what they were witnessing is indeed out of the ordinary. They are going to be 100% certain, at least in their mind, that what they witnessed is something anomalous before putting their career on the line, especially when it comes to airline or military pilots who have jeopardized their careers in the past after coming forward. Because of this, they are also going to be considerably less likely to lie or fabricate, which is yet another reason their account is more credible. The only argument to be made is that these trained observers are more credible and more reliable as an eyewitness, not that they are incapable of making an observational error. I'm going to provide one such example that I think skeptics would have a difficult time claiming as having a conventional explanation. It applies to the trained observer argument I just made. This case will also be featured on the UAP probability worksheet episode that grades specific accounts. On October 18, 1973, Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Coyne and his crew were flying an Army Reserve UH-1H Huey helicopter from Cleveland to Columbus for a routine medical exam. On the return trip back to Cleveland at around 11 p.m. near Mansfield is when they had their encounter. At the time, Coyne had 19 years of flying experience. First Lieutenant Enrico Jetzi, a chemical engineer, was also at the controls. Behind them were Sergeant John Healy, the flight medic and Cleveland police officer, as well as Sergeant Robert Janacek, a computer technician. The helicopter was cruising at approximately 90 knots at around 2,500 feet. It was a clear and calm night with no moonlight. Sergeant Healy notices a single red light to the west, flying toward the south. A few minutes later, the crew chief Janacek observed the bright red light on the eastern horizon. At first, he thought it was a tower beacon or aircraft port wing light until it suddenly turned toward the helicopter and began rapidly approaching at what the crew estimated to be around 600 knots. Coyne immediately takes control of the helicopter from Jetsy because he thought the object was going to hit them. He braced for impact, pushing the collective down in an attempt to dive under the object. He then looks at the altimeter, which shows 1,700 feet, putting their descent at around 500 feet per minute. They simultaneously contact the National Guard aircraft tower in Mansfield to see if it was one of theirs. Shortly after the tower responded, they lost all transmission with them. Coyne then increased their descent to 2,000 feet per minute at around 100 knots, but they were still unable to avoid the object. It was easily keeping pace with the helicopter's descent, and Coyne assumed it was on a collision course. Coyne then attempts to perform evasive maneuvers to avoid it slamming into their side. They all testified they thought it was going to collide with them and were in fear for their lives. Suddenly, the object goes around the front of the helicopter, just slightly above it, and stops in midair. All four of them described a 60-foot-long by 20-foot-tall, cigar-shaped, slightly domed, gray metallic structure with what appeared to be windows along the top of the dome. They described a red light at the nose of the craft and were close enough to see it refracting off the gray hull. It then shines a pyramid or cone-shaped light from the rear undercarriage of the craft, which began moving over the helicopter, ultimately enveloping the entire cockpit in bright green light. As this happened, the helicopter began to climb for about 10 seconds from 1,700 feet to 3,500 feet, as if the craft was dragging the helicopter upwards at an astonishing rate. Such a maneuver would be impossible for any helicopter. As suddenly as that happened, the green light shuts off and the crew feels what they described as a bounce, releasing the helicopter from its apparent grip. The craft then shoots off at high speeds, executing a turn over Lake Erie, and is gone within a few seconds. Sergeant Healy, the Cleveland police officer, recounted the story to a colleague the next day and said, quote, "It scared the living hell right out of me." Coyne immediately went to the media after the incident, giving the military no chance to bury the account. He told his story to the Plain Dealer and later appeared on Dick Cavett, which is available to watch on YouTube if you want to witness the veracity of his claim. Hearing him discuss the encounter makes it difficult to discount the event, leaving little to no chance that it could be misinterpreted as something mundane. He eventually appeared before the United Nations because of it in 1978, 5 years after the incident. A detailed report with interview transcripts can be found in a 1979 CUFOS PDF by Jenny Zeidman on CUFOS.org. It also features detailed drawings of the craft and incident. The document can be downloaded or listened to since it includes an AI-generated vocal transcript. I encourage anyone who reviews the report to find a single flaw or inconsistency in the corroborated testimony, or provide an alternative explanation to what they might have witnessed that wouldn't involve a suggestion of NHI. Feel free to point out any you might find by responding in the comment section. The official stance? A meteor or known aircraft. Even a skeptic has to admit that's just ludicrous and is in no way, shape, or form even remotely close to what the witnesses described. But this is a typical response put forth by skeptics in order to explain away a valid account. A hoax would be more of a credible explanation, but highly unlikely considering there were other white eyewitnesses to the event. In addition to the 4 extremely credible witnesses in the helicopter who put their careers on the line by coming forward with a story, a family of 5 driving in the vicinity pulled off the road to observe the encounter and were within 1,000 feet of the event. The mother of the family insisted their last name not be published, but they consisted of a couple and their 3 children, all giving extensive testimony in that same report. They all got out of the car to see it more clearly, and their descriptions matched that of the helicopter crew. That same night, Lee Kaiser and his sister went in their backyard and witnessed an oval object with a red light in the sky. Then suddenly everything was bathed in green light. Gene Elias, who lives 6 miles from the Mansfield airport, was in bed and heard a low, loud helicopter, afraid it was going to crash. She initially hid her head under the pillow in anticipation of the crash, but then pulled off the pillow because her son John yelled from his bedroom that his room had suddenly lit up with a green light. Brian Stevens, Glenn Stout, and a couple of co-workers watched from another proximal location as they saw a lighted object about to collide with a helicopter. Yet another witness, Judith Ham, screamed because she thought 2 planes were about to collide in midair. All of these people were in the vicinity of the encounter. This particular case, and there are many others like it, is an example where there is little to no wiggle room for alternative explanations to what the witnesses actually viewed, up close and personal. It's also an example where anecdotal evidence from multiple sources can provide us with an accurate account of something that actually occurred, exactly how it was described. At the very least, it's a case that cannot be readily explained away, and that through process of elimination, common sense, and deductive logic leaves only one other possible alternative: a secret advanced military craft built no later than 1973. However, this would also beg the question as to why the military would conduct a test flight operation that interacts in a hostile manner with one of their own craft in full public view, as opposed to a controlled operation on a remote base with all actors sworn to secrecy. I'm sure we can all agree this would never happen, and that any test flight of a secret craft designed to interact with a mundane craft would occur at a controlled location. Again, skeptics do not subscribe to this possibility either, which is why all they have to fall back on are objects mistaken for meteors, balloons, ball lightning, Venus, and other explanations that would be difficult to misidentify at such close proximity. But it's all they have in their basket of excuses when they are forced to provide an alternative explanation. I would be very interested to see how Mick West, Brian Denning, or Michael Shermer would interpret this account if they actually looked closely at the facts and testimony of the case. Or would they adopt the mantra of the UAP task force and argue that the case is too old to be analyzed since the eyewitnesses might be deceased, even though that should have no bearing on the documented evidence? All of the testimony, eyewitnesses, and accounts have already been recorded and vetted. The information remains available to the public with no cross-examination needed, and an assessment can be made without the need for any redundant or repetitive testimony. Now, I'm not arguing that skeptics have no valid assertions when it comes to some of their arguments against some notorious cases or the extraterrestrial hypothesis in general. I'm also not saying I subscribe to all of those assessments, just that they should be equally contemplated when reviewing the topic. Both skeptic and proponent appear to embrace an extreme interpretation, either wholeheartedly for or staunchly against. The skeptic often focuses on the negative aspects of a case or sighting and highlights any evidence against it, while the proponent focuses predominantly on the favorable aspects of it, ignoring any potential evidence to the contrary. There is no happy medium when both make valid points. However, there are more UAP proponents who are skeptical regarding some reports than there are skeptics willing to at least admit to some level of possibility for the ETH. Skeptics of the phenomenon really should lend some credit or worth to other methods of seeking a particular truth about something unknown or mysterious when there is at least some supporting evidence for such claims. It doesn't matter that there is no smoking gun, physical evidence or definitive answer one way or the other, especially if proponents stick to pressing for a mere consideration of the unexplained evidence that deserves at the very least the acknowledgement of a possibility. By considering other truth-seeking methods as valid in their own right, even if only to a limited extent, an honest and open look at the available evidence should follow. Something must be said for logical deduction, process of elimination, credible video evidence, and yes, anecdotal testimony, especially from credible sources when the object is in close proximity. After all, there are numerous scenarios where proof of something that isn't necessarily based on scientific rigor or physical evidence would be more compelling. For example, if an alien intelligence landed on the White House lawn and exited the craft to be recorded live by multiple networks, that event would and should be considered more of a factual claim of non-human intelligence in our presence than any artifact tested in a lab and proven to be otherworldly. This is an example where scientific rigor would be moot, inconsequential, and unnecessary. The ETH would essentially skip any notion of a theory to become an undeniable part of reality, and all because of a collective anecdotal account backed up by a live video of the event. In the meantime, it's fine if a skeptic refuses to grant the phenomenon any level of probability or likelihood based on these factors, regardless of what an arbitrary calculation of the evidence might suggest to proponents. But not meeting them halfway by granting it as at least a possibility and demanding more evidence when they know there isn't any is irresponsible, unscientific, and could backfire in the face of solid evidence that may one day surface. That rigid position is why many proponents accuse skeptics of adhering to scientism, basically their own brand of a belief system. This is where the UFO community would be better served to equally avoid making absolutions themselves, refrain from using the term belief when referring to the phenomenon, and instead stick to probabilities and possibilities. This may very well be the necessary middle ground that moves the conversation forward without either side needing to claim absolute certainty on anything. I have already briefly mentioned the additional truth-seeking methods of special in previous episodes that could supplement what is typically regarded as scientific certainty, and will outline them in much more detail in the episode following my interview with Stephen Bassett. These methods might also help skeptics themselves avoid making their own brand of logical fallacies that they regularly accuse proponents and conspiracy theorists of consistently committing. While scientific fallacies and logical fallacies are basically the same thing, when referring to reasoning errors that conspiracy theorists or UAP proponents make, they are often referred to as logical fallacies. It's true that many in the UFO community commit logical fallacies every day when they approach the topic, but skeptics too sometimes commit them on the other side of the aisle. The following is a quote by Professor Alexander Wendt in Sovereignty and the UFO, Political Theory, Wendt and Duvall, 2008, page 611. It was formulated in response to our ontological security being threatened when it comes to scientists or the general republic accepting the possibility of aliens getting here from a distant star system, suggesting we may no longer be the top dogs in the universe. He stresses that this used to be a fear among the religious elite, but has since shifted to the scientific elite. In it, he states the following, quote, UFO ignorance is not simply a gap in our knowledge, like the cure for cancer, but something actively reproduced by taboo. Thus, our puzzle is not the familiar question of ufology, what are UFOs, but instead, why are they dismissed by the authorities? Why is human ignorance not only unacknowledged, but so emphatically denied? In short, why a taboo? These are questions of social rather than physical science, and do not presuppose that any UFOs are ETs, only that they might be. He goes on to add, although a metaphysical assumption, anthropocentrism is of immense practical import, enabling modern states to command loyalty and resources from their subjects in pursuit of political projects. It has limits, however, which are brought clearly into view by the authoritative taboo on taking UFOs seriously. UFOs have never been systematically investigated by science or the state, because it is assumed to be known that none are extraterrestrial. Yet in fact, this is not known, which makes the UFO taboo puzzling given the ET possibility. In those statements, Wendt appears to shed light on the Dunning-Kruger effect, in which there is an uninformed cognitive bias against the topic. While there are skeptics who are very knowledgeable about the UAP topic, some who even make a living or hobby from debunking it, most of them are not. Neil deGrasse Tyson is a notorious example. While he appears to come across as informed, it's only because he uses sleight of hand by consistently referring to his knowledge of astrophysics combined with a lack of hard evidence for the ETH. I suggest listening to the Theories of Everything podcast episode from July 13th, 2023 for a good example. Fact is, the majority of scientists and skeptics are mostly uninformed regarding the subject and, frankly, prefer it that way. That certainly doesn't prevent them from weighing in with an uninformed opinion, however. The giggle factor is another error committed by academics who are asked serious questions about the phenomenon. When asked publicly about the possibility of visitors from outer space, they'll usually scoff, produce a condescending smile as they smugly blast the UFO people for believing in such nonsense, and confidently assure everyone that it's all just a bunch of hooey. After that, it's all giggles and mockery shared between the scoffer and interviewer. SETI astronomers were victims of it back when they first started searching for radio signals by what some of their colleagues quipped as looking for, quote, little green men. SETI, in turn, felt compelled to distance themselves from being associated with the UFO community, but then expressed a similar reaction to those coming forward with legitimate reports. Except this time it was, quote, little gray men. It's hard to blame SETI researchers for having such a negative attitude toward, as they put it, the tinfoil hat community, since the associations some academics made between them and the UFO community directly affected their funding. An additional motivation for these attacks is the obvious conflict of interest factor. Why search for distant alien signals if they're already here? If SETI astronomers searching for distant signals were to admit to even a remote possibility that they might already be here, they would jeopardize any chance of getting funding for trying to find that needle in a haystack. Their immediate presence would also threaten a scientist's way of life, especially if the beings were willing to share the secrets of the universe with everyone. Why practice science at all if that were imminent? Simply ask the aliens about anything you wanted to know. Their presence might also threaten the laws of physics as we understand them, especially if they utilized an alternative means of propulsion to get here, one most academics have stated time and again is impossible. So of course scientists have a vested interest in ignoring the UAP problem, actively attacking it or poking fun at it. These worries also highlight the notion of ontological shock, or being forced to question one's worldview. A learned scientist married to their particular field of study, who, quote, knows in their hearts and minds that it's impossible for any kind of non-human intelligence to be in our presence, will fight tooth and nail against even the remotest of possibility, and may feel compelled to actively attack it. Not only could the idea of it jeopardize their career, but it could also threaten their conception of reality in general. They are aware that the very existence of NHI in our presence would completely shake, if not crumble, the public's confidence in science, and that they would then be forced to apply actual scientific rigor to the phenomenon, something they should have done from the start. Those academics less prone to ontological shock, who might secretly consider the ETH as a valid possibility, might be more concerned with being accused of heterodoxy. Since it's a bit unorthodox for a scientist to even consider the ETH, given the notion it's at odds with their scientific peers, Some will choose to hide their interest in the topic and will often express dishonest opinions about it when confronted. Additionally, one of the many flaws in the peer review process would bar them from publishing any serious papers on the topic. Not only would most academic journals refuse to publish their work, but an attempt to submit one might seriously hinder their career and tarnish their reputation. This glaring bias not only jeopardizes any serious research into UAP, but many other scientific fields as well. In addition to committing errors in scientific reasoning, skeptics and scientists are also guilty of committing logical fallacies, especially when it comes to approaching this topic. Brian Dunning, host of the Skeptoid podcast and professor of logical fallacies himself, committed one against the same individual on 2 separate episodes. Sorry, I couldn't resist getting on the same level for a moment to prove my point. 2 instances of an ad hominem attack were leveled against the late Stanton Friedman, infamous ufologist, and yes, Brian, he was an actual nuclear physicist. His first attack appeared on episode number 79, Aliens in Roswell, in 2007, and was made prior to Friedman's passing in 2019. He stated, quote, Stanton Friedman, an obsessed UFO wacko, started interviewing everyone he could find who was still alive who had been connected with the incident and began constructing all sorts of elaborate conspiracies. Wacko? Is that how we refer to someone attempting to solve a mystery? In the second instance, episode number 853, Brazil's Roswell from 2022, he referred to Friedman strictly as a, quote, UFO author, and went on to state, quote, he's usually introduced in UFO films as a nuclear physicist, but in fact is a career UFO author and lifelong promoter of alien visitation claims. End quote. Dunning used the snarky comments in a manner intended to detract attention away from Friedman's accomplishments as a scientist and to discredit those achievements by focusing on his title being strictly that of a ufologist. Dunning consistently refers to logical fallacies throughout his podcast program and produced a 2-part episode that covered most of them. Dunning, as well as many others in the skeptical community, also commit the guilt by association fallacy. They will often refer to those in the UFO community as wearing tinfoil hats, a derogatory label first used in a 1927 short story by Julian Huxley titled The Tissue Culture King. In the story, the main character wore a metal hat so that he couldn't be mentally controlled by a villain scientist. It was later adopted by skeptics in an attempt to delegitimize UAP reports or make light of conspiracy theorists. By associating serious UFO researchers with those who wear tinfoil hats, the hope is that people won't take ufologists seriously either. A similar strategy is used when skeptics highlight UAP reports that turn out to be mundane, or when they focus on known hoaxers who may have once had a following. The suggestion or unspoken logic is that the whole phenomenon must be fake or mundane, since these cases or individuals are. Regardless of how many cases they might debunk or attempt to debunk, there are hundreds of other reports that remain unexplained, many of which they wouldn't even attempt to explain away or else risk injecting laughable explanations. Blaming Venus for an object making erratic maneuvers at only 100 yards away from a credible eyewitness who has everything to lose should be considered the less likely explanation, regardless of how extraordinary the alternative may be. While the account may not necessarily be proof of anything, the report of an anomalous craft in some instances is more credible than the alternative provided by the skeptic. And whether skeptics admit it or not, they too are guilty of confirmation bias when it comes to this topic and will often resort to observational selection. When that doesn't work, they will ignore the case altogether and focus on others that might have flaws in order to promote their narrative. Regardless of how credible an eyewitness claim may be, how unlikely it is they fabricated the story, how unlikely it is they misinterpreted what they witnessed based on the proximity of the object to them, or how lucid their account, a skeptic will ignore all those signs of an accurate and honest assessment in order to support their biased position. They will inject any possible mundane explanation they can come up with, regardless of how much it couldn't possibly align with that testimony. When that doesn't work, they will suggest the witness might have hallucinated, misremembered, or embellished the account. And when there's no evidence for any of that, they might suggest the witness is being dishonest, even in instances where the person has everything to lose by coming forward in the first place, especially airline or military pilots. Since the skeptic cannot possibly accept any testimony that might defy their worldview or put the laws of physics in jeopardy, they dig in and become biased in their approach to the topic, fighting tooth and nail to support the status quo. This attitude almost resembles a religion or belief system itself, one based on science and physicalism. Their coup de grace when this fails because the witness and account is impeccable, simply ignore the case, or cry that it was anecdotal while repeating the mantra, "Where's the physical evidence?" Their ace up the sleeve can help them escape any logical reasoning or process of elimination that might suggest no other possible explanation. That's how they get away with their own brand of confirmation bias. It's important to note, however, that proponents are often just as guilty. Best way for them to avoid it? Refrain from using the term belief and instead refer to accounts in terms of probability, not absolute truth. When a scientist is reluctant to discuss the UFO topic among peers, yet harbors an open mind to it in private or to those he knows, Dr. J. Allen Hynek called this approach the committee complex. He witnessed instances of it during his time at Project Blue Book in the 1960s, because some of the academics feared embarrassment or ridicule among their peers for studying something that may be considered unscientific. We could rightfully assume this continues to occur today based on the stigma that still surrounds the topic. The bandwagon fallacy, or appeal to peers, forms part of the committee complex. Dr. Peter Sturrock of Stanford did a study in 1975 and surveyed a large number of astronomers, asking them whether they thought UFOs were worthy enough, in their opinion, of being scientifically studied. He also asked them how much they've studied the subject in their spare time. On his graph, the less a scientist has studied the topic, the less open and more closed-minded they were about it. Just the opposite for the ones who actually looked into it without prejudice. While scientists will argue that science is built on probability, it seems they treat the ETH as exempt from that consideration. Skeptics rightfully argue no physical proof or hard evidence, but that leaves no wiggle room for accounts that should be taken seriously. Since they feel it is appropriate to place such a high degree of proof on the topic, it should be fair to allow for a separation between the pursuit of an established truth and the pursuit of a likelihood or probability. So while science is ultimately built on probabilities, that doesn't mean a level of probability for NHI should be left out of the conversation, especially if the UFO community refrains from matter-of-fact statements that encourage the whole extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence mantra in the first place. As long as proponents avoid claiming absolute fact regarding an account, the statement becomes meaningless. What should be noted is that logical fallacies could be avoided by both camps if only each side refrained from making any matter-of-fact claims for or against the phenomenon. It isn't that science or the scientific method is flawed when it comes to contemplating the UAP topic, more that scientists and different personalities within the skeptical community produce poor scientific answers against the possibility of it being NHI. Some distort how the topic should be approached and avoid even contemplating the possibility they could be here in our skies without truly looking at the evidence or having any curiosity regarding the topic. Other skeptics actually do look at the various points of evidence and leave the possibility of NHI on the table, but not enough of them. Nevertheless, skeptics are needed in the quest for truth surrounding the phenomenon. They indirectly help with the process of elimination portion of seeking a truth, forcing proponents to tweak their arguments and reevaluate their facts. This ultimately assists with the philosophical examination of the topic. Continued criticism of the phenomenon among debunkers, scientists, and skeptics in the face of ever-increasing evidence could be the result of them doubling down on something they've already devoted to debunking. They are now committed to that narrative because if they ever backpedaled and admitted to even the possibility of something anomalous being otherworldly, it would destroy their credibility. In other words, don't think skeptics will ever back down from their position, even if physical evidence for the existence of UAP as NHI surfaces. It will only embolden them twofold and motivate them to speak out against it even more. They would have to actually land, get out of the craft, and say hi to the world, an event that wouldn't demand any physical evidence whatsoever, before ever admitting they could be wrong. It's almost as if skeptics are trading basic common sense for a demand for physical evidence, even in instances where the anecdotal testimony is overwhelming and appears to leave no conclusion other than NHI or secret technology considered impossible by science. It seems they feel emboldened to turn a blind eye to the possibility since they comfortably hold the no physical evidence wildcard. However, there's no way some of the credible sightings occurring in the presence of upstanding eyewitnesses in close proximity can be explained in mundane terms. But because they have to stick with the status quo and debunk at all cost, that remains the narrative in the face of any kind of evidence that isn't physical, testable, and repeatable. So let's all of us in the UFO community remove that declaration from their arsenal by avoiding any mention of a definitive claim regarding any case put forth, even those that might appear highly probable for NHI involvement. Let's make that argument moot and instead throw them a curveball by sticking to claims of possibility and probability. Let's take control of the narrative and force them to at least meet the community halfway. We don't need to prove any case to them as being real, only that there is a real possibility for NHI in our presence. That's when real progress will become possible. That's when both sides might actually start to work together to solve this mystery. More and more academics are already coming around to this possibility, though perhaps not enough. To list them all out would require an entire episode in itself, but that number still pales in comparison to the number of those who either ignore or actively criticize those who take the topic seriously. Michio Kaku is just one example of a famous scientist who only recently came around to the ETH idea. In his June 2022 interview with Joe Rogan, he stated, quote, "The burden of proof has shifted. It used to be the burden of proof was on the people who believe in UFOs. Now the burden of proof have shifted to the Pentagon, to the military. Now they have to prove that these aren't extraterrestrials." End quote. While I understand what Kaku is getting at, and it's refreshing to see a physicist taking the topic seriously, but I think it's another example where proof should be left out of the conversation. It's still too early to establish any kind of proof, and even if it wasn't too early, both sides should share in this so-called burden. That, and we aren't even sure the NHI are extraterrestrial in the first place, an important detail that also remains to be established. But who am I kidding? We all know the military would have nothing to gain by helping to prove anything with regard to this topic. It would certainly not be in their best interest, regardless of what they might already know. In conclusion, when it comes down to it, it appears there may only be two interpretations to account for some of the best cases out there. They're either based on secret government projects that rely on a technology or propulsion system that defies the laws of physics as we know them, or they are some type of NHI. It must be noted that these possibilities are not mutually exclusive, since both could be true, especially if reverse engineering is a thing. This is where the special truth-seeking methods can assist in providing the best tentative answer, because none of this deduction or contemplation should ever be based on attaining an absolute fact. We can all agree that scientific certainty is a rare bird, so it shouldn't matter whether or not an alleged extraordinary proposition enters the conversation. Alternative methods for uncovering a truth should be supplemented along with scientific scrutiny, since this kind of testimony isn't going to ever go away. While most cases are not all that definitive or leave other potential explanations to enter the conversation, it only takes a single case that leaves no other reasonable interpretation to validate the UAP as NHI proposition, which would, in some cases, discredit a skeptic's entire line of reasoning. Either way, it suggests that skeptics might want to revise their approach to the topic if they wish to be taken seriously in the future should AI become complex enough to definitively analyze the best video accounts. They can be as confident as they wish that these programs will deduce all videos to be natural or mundane, but no amount of confidence will support their staunch position should the opposite turn out to be true. At the very least, skeptics shouldn't entirely eliminate the possibility of the phenomenon being based on those conspiracy theories that suggest we have developed a secret super technology the government has successfully kept from the public for decades, even though it would suggest we've had it for around 80 years. Perhaps they'll instead be thankful that it would give them a potential out for what appears to be their arch nemesis, the dreaded NHI interpretation. Hopefully I covered most of the main points regarding skeptics and scientists with regard to this topic. I'm sure I left out many others, but similar arguments related to the skeptical approach will appear in later episodes that apply more so to those individual topics. Either way, anything I don't cover on the program will appear in the book once it's released. I invite any of you who might want to contribute to highlight any other logical fallacies or errors in scientific reasoning committed by skeptics that I didn't cover in this episode within the comments section of the podcast. That's all for episode 4, and I hope you'll join me in mid-November for episode 5, my very first interview. I'll be hosting UAP lobbyist and executive director of the Paradigm Research Group, Stephen Bassett, in what's sure to be another two-parter. The interview will take place on November 15th, 2 days following the House Oversight Committee UAP hearing. I'll upload part 1 of the episode on Monday, the 18th, and provided the interview lasts more than a couple of hours, part 2 will appear the following Monday, the 25th. Because of this unforeseen opportunity that presented itself much earlier in my journey than I could have ever anticipated, the special episode will have to get bumped to mid-December at the latest. Be sure to visit uapasnhi.com for an overview of other topics that will be discussed on this program. I should have t-shirts and mugs ready to order from the site shortly after this episode airs, or I may offer them through a Patreon subscription. Thanks again, everyone, for watching or listening, and I hope you'll join me next time. This week's quote was made by Thomas E. Bearden, Ph.D., electrical engineer and former lieutenant colonel who worked on government black projects. At the very beginning of his 2001 paper titled Extracting and Using Electromagnetic Energy from the Vacuum, he states, quote, "The first principles of things will never be adequately known. Science is an open-ended endeavor. It can never be closed. We do science without knowing the first principles. It does in fact not start from first principles, nor from the end principles, but from the middle. We not only change theories, but also the concepts and entities themselves, and what questions to ask. The foundations of science must be continuously examined and modified. It will always be full of mysteries and surprises."